So you might recall from last class, I mentioned the example of eye contact, where depending on the culture, eye contact could be seen as a good thing, right? It could be seen as something that people use in order to understand each other. But in other cultures, maybe direct eye contact is seen as rude or disrespectful, right? So we can see here that there's both the cultural elements and cultural differences going on, as well as the interpersonal, since interpersonal is focused on two people. Organizational conflict would be a larger group, so the 12 Angry Men example from Wednesday. Or community can be a larger population. So if you've ever seen Parks and Rec, right, one of the town hall style debates is a common setting where that type of disagreement happens. So this is trans-contextual. It's happening both here in intercultural and up here in interpersonal. Want to check in and see, is there anybody that's here for the first time today? Okay, so 3 of you. So I have asked folks who are here for the first time to just give kind of a quick introduction. And if you can think about a time that you've dealt with any sort of conflict recently with another person, you're welcome to share that. We just had folks who talked a little bit about where they're from, what their major or potential major is, and so on. So why don't we start right here?
My name is Haley Virtue. I am from Orangeville, California. I'm an ag science major. And I grew up in a household where my parents had different parenting styles. So conflict resolution is very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. Socialization, parents, or their approaches to conflict is definitely a really big source of division. And the way that modeling and role models from family members can influence the way we approach conflict can be a really big aspect too. So glad to have you in the class. Glad you're able to find the room and everything. Thanks for your introduction. So we've got a couple other folks here. Remind me, who else is new here for today? Yeah, welcome.
My name is Brooke Hall. I'm from Hermiston, Oregon. My major is business admin, and the recent conflict would be I disagree with my father upon moving into his arms. He thought I should live with his grandparents. I disagree. We're still on that.
Sure. And remind me your name again? Brooke. Awesome. Yeah, these conflicts happen a lot where people are disagreeing, on logistics, on, maybe there's a lot of value in terms of family versus independence, moving forward in life, costs. There's so many elements that go into that. I think we talk a lot about how we can understand and engage with one another on why people come to very different conclusions on issues like that. Got one other person here for today, new.
My name is Casey Otway. I'm from Diamond, Oregon. And I guess a conflict I've had in communicating is usually just arguing with my brothers over random stuff.
Sure. A lot of these kinds of conflicts and arguments can be definitely off and on, right? Sometimes we feel like we just argue or debate with people for fun. It's just part of the relationship and how the relationship works. And so we'll talk a lot about how, for all 3 of you in the class in general, right, conflict's not necessarily a bad thing in conflict management. It's about how we create positive outcomes and avoid negative ones in conflict, right? And as we'll be talking about for today, one of the biggest negative consequences of conflict is the issue of groupthink. So there's a lot of examples that we can think of groupthink where there is a really big communication breakdown among a group of people, an organization, or even just 2 people, because the folks didn't feel like they could bring out their whole selves and their whole sets of concerns. So one really big example that's talked about in the first chapter of JAMP that we'll be getting into is the issue of Bay of Pigs. How many of you before this class had heard of the Bay of Pigs invasion before? Yeah. So it's something that's talked about a fair bit in U.S. history. It happened under John F. Kennedy's presidency. And essentially, right, it was a large-scale foreign policy failure that was related to how we attempted to create political change in Cuba. So we'll talk a little bit more about that example. One more recent example, and I know this is a heated and politically charged topic. You can think that our decision to stay or withdraw in Afghanistan is a good or bad thing, right? I'm not here to convince you one way or the other, but I think regardless of where you come down on that, there was room for improvement in the withdrawal process. And I think that's an example in a more contemporary context of groupthink implicating at an administrative level what that process looked like. So, last class, we talked about the New York Times article that was getting into the role of forming relationships with family during the pandemic. We talked about how in that article, a lot of folks experienced a level of tension and conflict and disagreement because they were moving back in. Several folks in the class mentioned, right, that whether it's being under quarantine for COVID or working from home, that they felt unique tensions with friends, family, romantic partners, and so on, that they didn't necessarily feel before. The proximity played a really big role. So it's important for us to think in context about how conflict is emerging in new and very different ways, especially related to the pandemic, and the ways that it impacts our communication, both in terms of people really close to us, but also, as we see a lot, right, in media, the larger scale social and political issues. We also talked about some core concepts and ideas. We overviewed both the good outcomes and bad outcomes that can happen from conflict management. We talked about how people can feel really hurt feelings, really frustrated, but can also feel like they have a better understanding and empathy toward one another. There's creativity that comes through resolving conflict and so on. So for today, I want to focus a little bit more on the back half of that chapter, which gets more specifically into the issue of groupthink and the negative consequences of groupthink. We'll also talk about effective listening, which is a really crucial stage in conflict management. And we'll kind of wrap up with a preview of study circles. So you've probably noticed that for this class, we'll be doing study circles where a group of people will be working together and we'll be talking about a topic that there might be significant disagreement about. So one of the tricks that we'll see is that study circles can be facilitated and managed and can create a respectful and supportive environment where people can hash out those issues and come to a greater understanding as a group. So, I kind of want to break down what groupthink is in a little bit more detail, right? So groupthink is a breakdown in communication. That is, the communication is not working correctly. Something has gone wrong, right? In which the desire for promoting harmony is minimizing conflict, right? A lot of folks, myself included, consider ourselves to be conflict avoidant. We don't like getting into conflict because it can create fights, disagreements, and so on, right? And don't get me wrong, out of this class, I'm not encouraging you to go and get in fights with people, right? But what I am encouraging you to do is to recognize when it's appropriate to engage in respectful disagreement with each other. So when we focus on harmony, what happens is we don't have conflict or discussion about issues. We don't create a space for dissenting or disagreeing viewpoints to be heard, and those viewpoints could wind up making a huge difference in the overall outcome, right? Another problem of groupthink is that there's isolation from outside influences, right? So one of the critiques of a lot of academic spaces is this idea of the ivory tower, right? That a lot of academics and professors and instructors are not engaging with the real world. They're kind of isolated or separated out from that. And groupthink is a problem there, right? Where there needs to be this constant question. How is what we're doing useful and applicable and helpful? So inviting in additional perspectives, experiences is crucial to get out of that. So we'll talk about Bay of Pigs a little bit, but also put it into a more contemporary context with Afghanistan withdrawal and a couple other examples of issues that I'll ask you to brainstorm as a group. So I want to show you a short clip that provides some additional context into the Bay of Pigs invasion that you read a little bit about for today's reading.
these people are almost peaceful. Yeah, always just enormously successful. Couldn't fathom how they could be so famous. Well, that was brilliant.
Yes.
I don't know if those background.
Number of Rhodes Scholars, Dean Rush, the Secretary of State, had been a Rhodes Scholar. There were many Rhodes Scholars. There was George Bundy, who'd been the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Harvard at age 34. He was just, I think, 42 at the time. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, had been the president of Ford Motor Company at the age of 40. All of these guys were really smart and really successful and had never really failed in anything. And I do think you have to attribute part of what happened to the fact that when they got in a room together and they looked around at each other, they saw a lot of brilliant people who they respected, and then they, in themselves, they saw people who did not fail, and they forgot about Murphy's Law. You know, things go wrong. Yeah. So I jokingly say it might have helped to have a few less brilliant people, regular people, you know, in presidential administrations. People like me, for instance, I'm available. People will point out that things don't always go the way you plan them. And that would have been a good thing for people.
And people who ask what are thought to be dumb questions.
Absolutely, yeah, that's the thing. And nobody wanted to embarrass themselves by asking those dumb questions.
By the way, in this class, there are no dumb questions. Please interrupt me at any point if you have any questions about anything else. This is a part of why, right?
Right. And that, I take it, is part of why you say that groupthink took over.
Yes, groupthink did. There were a number of factors, I think, that led to this bad decision. You have to forgive them a little bit because this did occur only 3 months into the beginning of the administration. And a lot of these, they were still finding their way to the men's room. I mean, they hadn't gotten their sea legs yet. And then they also they didn't want to embarrass themselves in front of the president, so, or in front of each other. But groupthink is the famous book by Erving Janis, written in 1972, that was inspired by the Bay of Pigs. He was asking himself, how could it be that all these smart people would make such a bad decision? And he came up with a theory that when you get people with similar backgrounds into a room, there is an impetus to agree with each other. Nobody wants to stand out, particularly when, I mean, these guys really did come from, they had similar resumes. A lot of them had gone to East Coast boarding schools, Ivy League colleges. They knew each other socially. They had reason to agree with each other, to assume the other guy was right. The one person, I mean, Erving Janis's book really refers to one meeting particularly that happened just over 10 days before the invasion, April 4th of 1961, when you had all these guys in a conference room in the State Department. And Kennedy goes around and asks them what they think, and they all vote for it. Now later they all say they had major reservations about it, but they didn't voice them at the time. The one guy who did voice reservations was an outsider. It was a senator who really shouldn't have been at that meeting, Senator William Fulbright. Kennedy had invited him in knowing that he had problems with the plan. And he got up and gave this rousing speech about how this is a terrible idea, un-American, impractical, wrong in every respect. And he became the foil that everybody sort of ganged up on. And as Janis wrote, it really only confirmed what people believed. You know, when you have one person that you can say, oh, he's the outsider, those who already are prone to agree with each other, it sort of solidifies their belief in their own opinion.
This excerpt was brought to you by Massachusetts School of Law.
Sorry to damage your eardrums there. Yeah. Need some better mixing and video editing, apparently. All right. So I shared that for a couple reasons. I think that the example, right, Bay of Pigs and the way that it's described is really good here. So a couple things that immediately come to mind. First of all, A lot of these foreign policy experts, including Secretary of Defense, right, are people that come in and have a lot of experience and, really impressive resumes, so on. So you would think, on paper, these would be folks that would work together and prevent, a really colossal foreign policy failure. We also know, though, that a lot of them maybe came from a similar background, right? There's this East Coast boarding school of thought that was similar. You have the senator, Senator Fulbright, right, who came in and did offer a dissenting view, but there wasn't really a genuine engagement with that view, right? It was seen, like they said, as a foil, as somebody to disagree with or argue with, rather than to take seriously as a point of view. Another communication theory called spiral of silence theory suggests that when people identify that they're occupying a viewpoint that most people in the room don't have, they refuse to speak up, right? They don't want to be, the dissenter in the group. So despite the expertise and background, we went forward on this, didn't work, right? Similarly, I think in the case of the Afghanistan withdrawal, right, we saw a similar group of experts, including Secretary of State, Defense, and so on. It's still an ongoing process to understand many of the reasons that this was a foreign policy issue or failure, right? And one of the biggest ones that emerges as a theme is sort of consistent underestimation of the Taliban's speed at which they could reclaim and seize various cities, right? But that's another example of how groupthink, a group of people having, a different conclusion about a thing can lead to practical problems. So there's a lot of different symptoms of groupthink that we can unpack, right? It's sort of here's how you know when groupthink is happening. One of them is an illusion of invulnerability. Because we're qualified, because we're foreign policy experts, so-and-so is the Secretary of State, they can't be wrong. That's an appeal to authority, which is a logical fallacy. Just because an authority figure said something doesn't mean that that thing is true, right? You have to look at the underlying arguments and support behind that person. An unquestioned belief in the morality of the group. Oh, well, we're all secretaries of state, defense, chief of staff, and so on. We're good people. We're going to make the right choice. Rationalizing warnings. So in this case, right, Fulbright, this dissenter was seen as, they're just wrong, they shouldn't even be here, they're just totally off base. Stereotyping outsiders, right, is another way to do that. This is where a lot of things related to elitism can come in, right? We are people that are smarter than everybody else, and therefore we'll get this right, they're wrong. Self-censorship ties into this idea of the spiral of silence, the idea that you maybe have an opposing view, and as you heard in that video, right, there were people who had their reservations with basics, but they didn't speak up because they were worried about how it impacted the group and impacted the mission. They had their reservations, they didn't put them out there. Had they put them out there, maybe things would have gone better. An illusion of unanimity is the idea that people believe everybody else is on the same page. Oh, we all agree this is a good idea, right? We should go in, we should do it. Questioners have to conform, right? So if you disagree, your only option is to follow along with what other people are doing. So one way to push back against groupthink is to have outsiders or questioners have some degree of authority and power. And also the presence of mind guards, which are these sort of mental blocks that we create for ourselves to rationalize the decisions that we make. Maybe you have some type of reservation, but you say to yourself, you know what? Everybody else knows what they're doing, right? So I'm not going to speak up. I'm going to censor myself. So we can use certain tactics to, again, rationalize in our own heads why we think we're correct. By the way, again, after class, I'll have all these slides posted. So if you are falling behind, there's no need to worry. You don't need to get all of these down word for word. So there's a lot of ways that we can prevent and address groupthink as happens in the world. Yeah?
Well, and it being the 60s, back on the Bay of Pigs thing, I bet, I'm going to guess that some of them thought that they could be branded as a communist for disagreeing.
Right, right. So there's a lot of, and this ties, right, to a couple other things, right? Stereotyping outsiders. Either you agree and you're on board with us or you're a communist, right? So there's a lot of concerns about what options and alternatives might be available. And, you know, if you brought up a lot of fears about what happens if you don't speak up. So that's a really good point. So some of the ways that you can prevent groupthink can involve breaking down some of the stereotypes. Yes, I care about this country and I want this country to do the right thing. And I, you know, want us to do the best foreign policy move, but maybe this isn't it. Maybe there's a better option, right? It's a joke here, right? We need more dissenting opinions. Absolutely, 100%, right? So doing groupthink when it's suggested we shouldn't do groupthink. A critical evaluator. So that guy in the interview who apparently was talking really quietly because that got really loud, right? He was talking about how, oh, you know, I'll be a dissenter, I'll be in there, I'll be an average person. So critical evaluator oftentimes is somebody that doesn't necessarily have a personal stake in the issue, but is somebody that can really understand and parse out key points. This is used a lot in negotiation, right? You have a third party or third person. So say you and a relative are arguing over the state. You have a third person, like a mediator, that helps to evaluate both sides and issue a judgment, right? A jury oftentimes occupies that role too. Leaders can avoid expressing an opinion. So this might seem unintuitive at first, but if you're the president of the United States, rather than saying, I want us to do this, let's do it, maybe saying, here's an option on the table. I'm not going to tell you how I feel about it. Let's work on that together, right? Because you're probably going to skew toward following the leader and agreeing with what they have to say. So if you're a supervisor or boss at a company, and you're trying to figure out who to hire for a job, don't tell your employees, I prefer this candidate, let's hire this candidate. Because then all the employees are going to say, okay, yeah, I like this person too. Give them the chance to talk about it first. And then that will help you to get their honest opinion rather than getting yes people who will say what they think you want. Leaders avoiding going to meetings can sometimes be a good thing too, right? So if you're a leader like the president, your presence can oftentimes be a problem. It can skew the results and thinking. So having a space for other experts and people to talk amongst themselves can allow them the freedom and expression to hash it out a little bit more. Organizations setting up their own independent or smaller groups can help too. So maybe they're trying to decide who to hire for a job. And they break up into teams. One person looks at their previous work experience. The other person looks at their current job, right? Examining all effective alternatives is a good way to do that. So rather than saying, Bay of Pigs or nothing, right? What about this alternative plan that involves U.S. military presence? What about this approach? So on, right? In competitive debate, I did speaking debate in high school and college, we'd oftentimes put together the idea of a counterplan or a proposal that we thought was a better solution to the problem, but addressed some type of harm or disadvantage that we saw with the current approach. So for instance, right, rather than taxing businesses and companies who emit greenhouse gases, let's provide tax incentives to businesses that invest in green technology, right? So discussing the group with outsiders, including perspectives that don't have direct experience with the issue, can also be really helpful, right? Getting an average person in who can help gain perspective on the issue can just make sure that your group hasn't spiraled out of control. Help ground the group. Inviting other people to participate. Again, that would have helped a lot with Bay of Pigs. You had this one dissenter, but maybe other U.S. senators have another set of concerns about this policy. And then playing devil's advocate, right? There are times where playing the devil's advocate can be obnoxious, not very useful. But there's also times where really hearing out and examining an alternative viewpoint helps to solidify your existing viewpoint because you've exhausted and thought it through. Or it can help us to realize that, you know, maybe this option isn't so bad after all, this alternative. So devil's advocate can be a useful approach in preventing groupthink as well. So what I'm going to do is ask you to break off into small groups. You can decide these groups for yourselves, maybe with folks that are near you. I'd encourage, somewhere between 4 to 6 people in each group. So you might look at folks that are in rows near you. What I'd like you to do is to pick a different example of groupthink. So an example other than Bay of Pigs or Afghanistan, right? Think about another example. Maybe this is something like an advertisement or PR fail, right? Maybe it's something like, a policy action or anything that you feel like involves these steps that we've talked about. What went wrong in that situation? And what can be used to prevent this type of breakdown from happening? I'll ask one person in each group to just write the names of all the group members down and just jot down your responses to those things. So find some folks to talk to. We'll take about 10 minutes or so on this and chat about it again together as a group.
That's a good one too. I was thinking another one is like music. Like I don't know if you guys ever heard of it. I was thinking something not related to war. But like someone like an artist will go like rap or something like that, make a song, and then all the people around them will catch on and be like, oh gosh, that's so good. And they'll be like, okay, it must be good that everyone agrees with me, but that's just because they're like, yes, they just want him to feel that. Like, and then when I get
A lot of pop culture fits into that, right? It's like, oh, everybody loves this show, movie, or music, or whatever. I'm not really feeling it, but I don't want to share that because then I'd be disagreeing with the group, right?
Yeah.
So they try to convince them that who is the real one.
Well,
And the stage more people have votes already for the real one, Michelle. But after a couple people voted for the other Michelle, everybody is
By the way, it's nice to meet you all, Calvin. Oh, sorry.
I really
I wish I
What year are you guys?
And they like,
What did you like do
Yeah, so we took turns in the mail room based off where we're meeting
Yeah. So we talked about that one a little bit just now. If there's any other ones you can think about, there you go. The media, policy related, there's a lot of different stuff.
genocide? Just redo this a little.
What did you all settle on?
World War II.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of angles you can approach that too as well, right? Like,
We're looking at like something like kind of like everything for the environment, essentially, like different
yeah.
Or we can like his perspective too and say like all his generals, because he killed a lot of them and the ones who were left like obeyed him completely. Like so like when he made really bad military decisions, you're just like, yeah, go for it.
So, I don't know if you're familiar with Hannah Arendt. The forward is this book talking about the banality of evil, examining like Major General in World War II, Eichmann, who at the Nuremberg trial said, look, I was just following orders. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. And like, was completely convinced that he had done nothing wrong. There's a lot of problems that we're doing a lot of
Interesting. How big is he? Was it general?
yeah, or at least I don't remember his exact role, but he had a lot of authority and power.
Really? That's interesting. Yeah.
What type of manipulations go
You all think
this
We're gonna kill a ton of people. We're gonna be okay.
you're gonna be okay with that.
Yeah.
The prison experience? Yeah, the Philip Zimbardo, past prisoner of, yeah.
So which part of World War II do you want to say? Do we want to go every general, or do we want to just go giving people to
Preventing people to fall in line. It's not just.
Taking out the houses, like all these kind of like.
There's so many people that you can finish.
Right. It seems like there's a lot of countries involved in like healthcare, psychology, and whatever. It would be like, look, this is going to have long-term psychological damage, you know, to the prisoners or the guards and so on. Right? Yeah. So, yeah, that's a really good example.
should we do it, or is it?
I have two events and then we all have to go.
Right now.
Which I will, I think you see
That's that's due here. My next Sunday. This Sunday or next Sunday?
So it sounds like a lot of folks are making good progress. I'll give people maybe a couple minutes or so. Make sure you've got one person who's written down for your group, including names, and one person who's ready to share.
Let's see if I can split
Yeah, like they were encourage their behavior.
Do you play sport or anything? Oh, you also wrestle? Okay.
Yeah, so she's on the wrestling My hand got caught in the goat collar. I got dragged.
Yeah. So, real quick, what do you guys, with communication, would stop this breakdown? The other one I have right now is still something. But that did
I don't know. This is where it gets tricky. Authority, like authority.
higher power.
Yeah, higher power, like, yeah.
Have you guys ever watched the movie, like, based on true stories of World War II, where they Like, there's one from the Zulu or something, when this lady ends up putting her through
So go ahead and finish up the thought or idea that you're working on.
A lot more people doing that. That's something you
like someone needs to be above them. Be like them.
Yeah, so they had to check the balances, but they burned down the building. Like,
All right.
they burnt that down like.
So let's go ahead and come back together and have folks share the examples that your group put together. Is there a group that's interested in sharing first, both the example in terms of what went wrong and what kind of communication could have prevented or addressed that issue? Okay.
Okay, so we chose this thing called Marathon. It was just a convention for bands to use this like social media stuff. And what went wrong was that it wasn't planned well, and they had like bands passing out outside, no security, no water, nothing. And then the communication like for the end of it was if they had like taken more time to put together the card, and if they had communicated better with security and also communicated better with more people and more structure.
Yeah. A lot of conventions, events like that, there are so many logistical things to manage that you've got to have people in these dissenting and different roles to make sure that all the bases are going to be covered, right? Or the sort of scams, like I know there's been at least a couple documentaries on the whole Fire Festival thing, right? There's so many situations where these kinds of major events really do need those bases covered. So that's a really good example. I saw a hand over here on this side as well.
We talked about like World War II and like more so the point of view of like Hitler and how he was just able to get all these people to kind of just fall in line.
Mm-hmm.
And what went wrong was kind of the obvious there. There's a lot of people that were just mass genocide and killed, and nobody really kind of stepped in to go like, hey, this is wrong over there in the German power. Everybody just kind of went along with what he did and thought it was cool. And we said what communication could have prevented this breakdown was like some sort of higher power above Hitler, which obviously they had burned down that kind of legislative building, that those people that kind of had that authority to do that. So like, I guess what could have been prevented is that place not being burnt down and those people above Hitler saying, hey dude, this is wrong, you can't do this.
Right.
But obviously that wasn't really an option for them.
Right, right. And so there's like a communication failure on multiple levels, right? People that are not speaking up and pushing back against that, but also, you know, you have a dictator who is unwilling to hear opposing points of view as well. So there's ways that, you know, communication failure can kind of run both directions. There's a high-ranking Nazi official that I mentioned to the group, you know, Eichmann, who, according to Hannah Arendt, who analyzed Eichmann in The Melody of Evil, right? Eichmann was at the Nuremberg trials after World War II. People were asking him about what he'd done, and he said, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just following orders, right? Again, highlighting that problem of groupthink and an unwillingness to question or challenge that position of power. Let's do the group right behind.
So we discussed the Stanford prison trials, and we discussed like what went wrong was the guards took their act too seriously and took it too far, and there's no one to keep them in check, and instead it was encouraged, and the behavior persisted, and then it ended up resulting in a lot of psychological damage on both the guards and the prisoners. And this could have been prevented by like the professor just needing to consult more like psychologists too. He kind of just consulted people in the prison system and in a lot of those types of areas instead, so there was no one to evaluate his side of the psychological condition.
Right. So Stanford prison experiment, famous case with Philip Zimbardo, right, where people were randomly assigned the role of prisoner or guard and really acted out that role very intensely. And a lot of folks, in fact, both sued and discussed the long-term psychological impacts that study had on them. Like you said, greater communication with experts, health professionals, and so on could have prevented those really serious impacts from affecting people for the rest of their lives. Let's do the group here in the front, or are you all together?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you all talk about?
So basically we talked about, we kind of came up that it would have been basically about the same since World War II, they come out in the same way.
Sure.
problems that he found with that, or flags, basically used, give enemies advantages, and basically we exited the exact same way every time.
Yeah.
What we thought some ways to address this and how communication can help solve some of this is like really analyzing past mistakes, setting up outside groups, so hearing more opinions, not sticking with the same types of individuals who have been making these decisions, so looking outside of that, allowing for more discussion, allowing for more time for discussion and to hear those opinions, as well as really trying to get more opposing viewpoints, so that we can come up with processes and practical efforts that are more productive and are the same as what we're doing.
Yeah, that's a really great and extensive set of communication that we can do, right? And again, emphasizing bringing in those outside perspectives. You know, it's sort of like one of those what doesn't kill you makes you stronger situations. You get in those outside perspectives, you shouldn't be afraid of them, because if your argument really is the best one, then it's going to be able to withstand it, right? So it's a great way to test the perspective you're taking on an issue and make sure you've really thought it through. Is there another group over here, or did they grab everybody? Yes.
We talked about the polarization of local parties.
Yeah.
Each party likes to make things a different way. I think around Vietnam is when a big change happened. And as time went on, it just increased because there's no like resolution there. The communication that could have prevented this would be examining all effective alternatives, inviting others from other political parties to discuss policy with each other.
Right. Right, and it's good to kind of historically track that, right? I'm glad you identified Vietnam as this key kind of turning point, because there are a lot of different ways that we can parse out and analyze something like political polarization, but this sort of core issue of folks not understanding each other, feeling like they're on different planets, right? And a lot of the major events, like Vietnam, that have affected that split, I think is really good to identify for sure. So these are all really good examples, and again, I think do a great job of showing us how something like a major blunder or problem that can have really serious impacts, you know, global death and genocide, psychological trauma, and so on, really show us the impacts of improper conflict management. So I'm really glad you all had the chance to share and talk about these a little bit. I know we spent a lot of time on this. I want to touch on a couple other things related to this chapter before we wrap up today, and we'll pick up on a few more of these things for next week. But some of the ways that we can address and deal with groupthink as well involve listening. Good listening skills can involve things like hearing, right? We're actually physically picking up. Oftentimes when we hear a point of view that we disagree with or we dislike, we'll tune out and be unwilling to hear what the other person has to say. Another thing we can do is deciphering the meaning, right? So what is the true intent or purpose of somebody's message? So if people had, identified that Fulbright was really expressing a concern with Bay of Pigs, then we probably would have taken that more seriously. Being a good listener means remembering, right? You hear somebody's name, you remember that for later, you pick up on that, you think about that over time. Thinking critically about the messages that you've received. Is this supported? Is this a well-executed idea? And then giving feedback. Right? There's no dumb questions. If you have any concerns or issues, you raise that to prevent that conflict from escalating and making sure that people are on the same page. Oftentimes, lack of clarity and confusion about the plan will lead many people to say, I don't understand what's going on, but sure, I'll rubber stamp it. So, listening styles, right? I mentioned Atticus Finch, right? If you've read or seen Kill a Mockingbird, empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and walking around in them for a while. We can engage in active listening, where we're really trying to understand the message. So you're really giving good eye contact, you're focused on facial expressions, you're focused on tone and that sort of thing, right? You're listening to the other person through active listening. Dialogic goes back to Aristotle, right? The idea that dialectic, according to the ancient Greeks, is the way that we can find truth. Through conversation, through hashing things out, through Socrates being obnoxious and asking a ton of rhetorical questions. Sympathetic listening means you're acknowledging somebody else's emotional state. Oh, I can tell that you're really frustrated right now. Whereas empathy, again, is taking that next step of putting yourself in that position. Oh, wow, you have got so much on your plate today. You know, you've got your cross-country meet right after class, your first week, you have so much going on, right? So sympathy is more about acknowledging, empathy is more about putting yourself in that person's shoes. Active is more about listening to understand. Dialogic is more about talking and playing a larger role in the conversation itself. There's a lot here. I'll have these slides up later, and again, we'll talk more about these elements next week. There's a lot of different ways that we can listen for conflict management effectively, and we'll talk more about some of these issues later. But it definitely involves letting people listen, giving them the chance to speak out, understanding and remembering the issues, taking notes, and that sort of thing. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more, too, about study circles. Again, that'll be one of the major assignments for the class. But a study circle, again, kind of similar to what you all did, is a group of people talking about an issue, which there might be disagreement, and a facilitator who takes a kind of neutral role and helps make sure the discussion is going smoothly. So again, next week we'll get more into some of the specifics about how to effectively engage in study circles. So for today, we talked a lot about groupthink. Again, this is a major problem, an issue with conflict management, and I was really impressed with the ways that the groups came up with different communication strategies to kind of, give a post-mortem about what went wrong, right? And this is an example of us falling forward. We learn from those mistakes, and we do a better job to prevent, a convention that doesn't have water, or an experiment that creates psychological harm. The IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, is a group that now examines the ethics of human subjects research, and its development happened in large part because of that study, right? So we can fall forward and learn from these mistakes to be better at managing conflict. Listening skills are incredibly important. We'll keep looking at those. We'll keep talking about how study circles can be used as a way to facilitate and deal with conflict too. So for next Monday, there is not a textbook assignment, but I am asking you to take a look at the Purdue OWL, which is a really great resource that has a ton of different tips on writing, citations, and so on. Make sure that if you haven't already, you've completed the intro survey by the end of the day. Because this class builds writing credit, I really want to get a sense of your own writing skills and the ways that I can help you improve your writing. And also make sure that you get a copy of your textbook if you haven't already for next week. Let me know if you have any trouble with accessing that textbook too. So, congratulations, unless you have any other classes or things going on. You've survived your first week at EOU for the year. So have a great weekend. It's been great to talk to you all. And I will see you all again on Monday. Make sure to turn in your group paper that has your names on it as you're leaving. Yeah. Turn in that group paper as you're leaving. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so athletics, awesome. Yep. And then just make sure that you're completing the makeup assignment for those days, and you'll be in good shape. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
I also have a question for you.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Oh, no problem.
Yeah.